This is the story I tell people when they ask me, what's the strangest thing that has happened to me during my years as a Yellowstone National Park Ranger was? It didn't happen at night or involve any real danger, but it has haunted me ever since it occurred over 30 years ago now. Many years ago, on an early June day, one of our crew members radioed in to say he saw something strange on Pelican Creek Trail, about 2 miles north of Fishing Bridge on Yellowstone's northern boundary. He asked that we come have a look for ourselves. One of us who responded was a man by the name of George Carpenter, probably and easily one of the most experienced trackers and woodsmen working for West Yellowstone District Ranger Ken Phillips. I was the other one that responded, along with a young woman in her early 20s who had no tracking experience at all. George led us through the woods until we came to what's known as Bridge Creek. We could hear Pelican Creek running downstream about 100 or so feet to our right. As George approached the bank of Bridge Creek, he suddenly stopped and looked up ahead where the sound of Pelican Creek seemed to emanate from. He had asked us if either of us had ever seen anything like it before. The three of us were still puzzled when he began pointing toward 3 sets of tracks that ran across where we were standing. The middle set of tracks appeared canine-like, but crossed over both groups on either side of it. We decided to proceed very cautiously, and the young woman was instructed to stay even with us as we moved down Pelican Creek Trail. These tracks were about 10 inches wide at their widest point, and appeared canine-like, but not the same way like any dog breed I'd ever seen before. They didn't look bear-like either. They had almost a human-like quality to them, if you could imagine such a thing. As we followed those tracks on the trail, I began getting an eerie feeling that something large and dangerous might lurk ahead of us. The other 2 rangers and I knew these forests well, having worked there for so many years, but we all agreed that what we saw in these tracks was something we'd never seen or heard or tell of before. The tracks themselves were very fresh, and the trail followed along the lovely Pelican Creek for quite a ways. And then it came to an area where it appeared that 3 dark blobs fell from above and landed on the side of the creek bank. We decided to proceed with extreme caution because I felt pretty sure that whatever made these tracks might be nearby by now. Nearing another bend in the trail, 2 figures emerged about 60 to 70 yards away, which froze when they saw us staring back at them. The young woman ranger panicked, ran screaming back up the trail toward Fishing Bridge. George and I both shouted out reassuring words to her as she ran through, trying to tell her that everything was all right. The 2 dark figures watched us for a moment or so, and then suddenly disappeared back into the forest, hence where they came. We never saw them again, but we did get an official report of the incident by the young ranger who had ran back up the trail. I'm not sure what they were, but they were more canine-like in appearance. I still shudder at the thought, even to this day. I'm a park ranger at Craters of the Moon National Monument/Preserve. For the wintertime, November through March, I work alone at night, monitoring our back loops and patrolling them using 4x4 vehicles to check for potential hazards for visitors, like downed trees across trail and other miscellaneous debris. My very first experience ever happened in November of 2014. I was clearing debris off one of the trails. After removing enough deadfall to clear the trail successfully, I drove ahead about 50 feet to where another tree had fallen across it. We had just come out of a bad storm, and the trail were a mess. When I got out of my vehicle to remove that tree, I heard something big running through the woods right behind me. Whatever it was made sounds like snorting and heaving, kind of like some sort of cross between a dog and a boar. No animal sounds like this are in the park that I could ever imagine. I looked around but didn't see anything, so I went ahead and began removing parts of the dead tree. After that, I got back into my vehicle and drove up to where I had seen whatever it was, or at least heard whatever it was, going through the woods. But there was no sign of anything, even though that this would have been a perfect place for something to bed down due to the thick underbrush and big logs and dead wood. To make sure it wasn't bears or elk or deer, which we do get a lot of, I parked my truck right at the spot wherever it was that disappeared into the woods, got out to listen. But whoever or whatever it was must have disappeared via another route, because I could hear where the birds were chirping and the wind were blowing through the pine needles. Next, I used my radio to call my coworkers at our headquarters, right across from where I was. Nobody responded, which wasn't surprising. After looking around for another 10 to 15 minutes, without hearing anything else strange, I got back into my vehicle and started down the trail again. Sure enough, after going about 50 yards, I saw something laying on a fallen tree limb in front of me. It appeared to be a wolf, with its head concealed, kind of like how it was behind its forearms. As soon as it heard the sound of my vehicle coming closer, this thing stood up on two legs, turned to face me, and then jumped and crossed the trail in front. My first thought was that it was an albino bear, so I continued driving back down the loop. But over time, I've wondered if this creature could have been what the ranger had described at Yellowstone National Park, who talked about a large black canine crossing his paths several years ago. Ever since then, I've never gone out patrolling on my own without somebody else here with me, just in case that thing is still around. This was reported on January 19th, 2015. My name is David. I was working as a park ranger at this location, which was redacted by the MNI, located in the Florida Everglades. One day, we had received a report that there was a strange screaming sound coming from nearby. On my radio, I was in contact with another fellow ranger, also redacted by MNI, who was one of the rangers that went to investigate. We began hearing the screams and we called backup, trying to locate each other. The screaming continued for another couple of minutes, until it suddenly stopped. Then, we hear a thud sound like something had fallen over. We waited a while before calling out, but there was no response. We decided to head towards where we thought the noise had come from. One of us began walking along this trail and then onto a boardwalk about 3 meters above ground level, and then heard it again. Help me. It sounded like whoever was making the noises were near me. I asked if anybody was there, and then I heard the same voice say, "Help you," and then it breathed. That's when we saw it. A short humanoid, about 4 meters away. The sun was behind it, so we couldn't see all the details, but its eyes looked much larger than normal. Having grown up in these swamps, I know what all kinds of wildlife look like. It's not anything that is native to the area, or any type of drug addict or homeless person. I mean, we're pretty far out in the swamps, way off the beaten track, which makes people think twice before coming out here. Plus, we deal with a lot of gators and other poisonous animals. I did a double take what I was seeing. It looked weird, and then quickly shouted at my partner, "Run!" He did, while I stood there frozen, rooted to the spot, for about maybe 5 to 10 seconds. I finally caught up with him when he'd asked me if I saw that thing. When we got back to headquarters, we were both having uncontrollable heart palpitations, terrified by what we had witnessed. I had only been working as a ranger for maybe 3 years at this point. We were told that some woman had called to report strange screaming noises, as if someone or something was in very serious trouble. 2 of us were sent on a boat over the river, which is where we thought it must be coming from. We felt nervous, but nothing could have been as bad as what we approached. When we got close enough to make out what was going on, all I can say is thank God there was a quick fog rolling off the water. It helped to conceal our approach. There, on the shoreline, were these 2 men, and something hunched over between them. They appeared to be gutting fish and throwing their entrails into the swampy waters around them. The thing that had caught my attention, though, were the heads. They weren't actually men. They were these beings. Round red heads and huge black compound eyes with long, slender, stinger-shaped mouths. My partner saw the same thing as I did. But then these things turned towards us, and it's when we had a sudden rush of terror hit us like a wall of bricks. The head had only been the size of a grapefruit from where we were standing, but now, as we were seeing it closer, it was all the more terrifying. Their eyes went from black to glowing brightly in the approaching darkness, and for some reason, they both looked directly at us. We made our retreat quickly, back to headquarters where we had reported what we saw. We mentioned that whatever this thing was, it's not like anything we'd ever seen. I think it's still out there too, because recently, I have heard similar accounts of people fishing in the area and having an encounter with these insectoid-like beings. I'm a park ranger from northern Kentucky. I've been working as a ranger for this past year, previously in the military, so I know what you guys do and how much hard evidence is out there regarding Bigfoot. I've always been a skeptic. However, I can't help but be intrigued by my latest encounter, just a few weeks back, while on duty at the Jenny Wade Trail here in Taylorsville Lake State Park after work one night. First off, our park spans about 11 miles along the Lake Barkley near Clarkson, Kentucky. The Jenny Wade Trail is located on top of the bluff overlooking the lake. It's a highly scenic area, lots of wildlife activity. This incident occurred around 3:30 to 4 a.m. on Thursday, after working my 12-hour shift. The Jenny Wade Trail is relatively isolated and runs along the very edge of our park's borders, so to get to it, you have to travel down a long gravel road for roughly 10 minutes. The road forks off from another street, connecting to Kentucky 144 around 3 miles before reaching the trailhead. I was driving down the gravel road, heading towards Jenny Wade, when I came upon a highly tall man strolling in front of me who appeared to be lost, using his phone and what little light it provided, then stopping and looking at a map, it looked like. He seemed to almost not notice me as I crept up closer, asking if he needed any directions or help. When I asked what unit he was with, thinking at first he was with the U.S. Army administrators with our park services, he turned quickly, about 90 degrees towards me, and had a shocked look on his face. His movement seemed extremely unnatural, like it was forced or something, like it had caught me off guard, and made me jump back in my seat a little bit. He had long black hair that hung down past his shoulders, no facial hair. As soon as I saw him turn around, I noticed just how incredibly tall he was and how he was hunched over, something hard to tell in the dark. His head nearly scraped the top of my car door frame, while he stood there looking down at me. When he turned around, his eyes were a bright red color. Not bloodshot, but a red color I'd never seen before. They were as clear as any humans and very encouraging, as though they had a very internal illuminator attached to them shining out. This freaked me out. The man appeared to be wearing clothing that of the park administrator would wear. However, he seemed out of place, or so he acted, and his eyes seemed so strange. It made my heart race in fear and froze. He reached his hands out towards me and said something along the lines of, "I will devour your soul." His voice changed and sounded so demonic. I was petrified. I quickly dropped my window back down, driving towards Jenny Wade Trailhead, and I looked in my rearview mirror. He was still standing there on the side of the road, watching me go away. I pulled into the parking lot at Jenny Wade. I got out of my vehicle with some binoculars that we kept in our cars, just in case we needed it. I noticed a group of people about 50 yards behind him, walking down one of the trails on the other side of the main path, heading deep into some thick brush, off limits to visitors because it is hazardous due to slippery rocks and leading to a near 100-foot drop. After noticing them, he turned around and began walking towards them much faster, now out of sight below the trees. I figured he must have been lost. So now, I was armed with these and had a better view of what was going on. I drove back into the main parking lot to head up to one of our observation towers, which overlooks Jenny Wade and Lake Barkley, where I could contact them on the radio. When they did not respond to my calls over the radio several times, I decided that maybe it was best if I had another ranger drive me down there, in case these people were visitors who might not know about this rule of being in off-limit areas. I told another ranger named Jeffrey. The name changed for privacy reasons. What had happened? He said he had seen an older gentleman with long black hair and a beard out on Lakeshore area while patrolling on a patrol boat earlier that day. It is against regulations to be down there because of how dangerous it can be, but I did not think anything more of it. He said he had been planning to walk back up from where he had been, so we decided to stop by Jenny Wade on our way back. On our way, I told him about what happened with this person wearing these U.S. Administrator clothing, who appeared to be lost and acted very fidgety and weird, and even had a voice that changed. It was almost a paranormal supernatural experience that was terrifying. Well, about 20 minutes go by, and we arrived at Jenny Wade, get out of our car with our binoculars. But now the lost man was nowhere to be seen. We scanned around, not knowing where we were looking. As we made it through the area, Jeffrey told me to turn around because he had found an older man lying face down at the water of Lakeshore Beach, another area that's off limits. Jeffrey said this older man had been floating face down in the water, and he seemed to be deceased. I thought maybe Jeffrey was joking or testing me. So, when we arrived there, we saw the same person. It was the man from before, his eyes still red, and he appeared deceased. But before we can call anybody in to retrieve his body had disappeared. Now, we did not tell anybody about this encounter. Nobody would ever believe us or take us seriously. So, I'm sharing this story with the rest of you right here, right now. Please, share this story with your friends and family. Let them know the truth about these people whom many other rangers have seen in northern Kentucky, just like me. I believe that they are not people at all, but something else entirely. Something otherworldly. They maybe do not mean us harm, but I want everybody who visits Kentucky to stay away from the shoreline. It can be hazardous to them if any of these creatures who take on human form were to attack, which might happen if they feel threatened or possibly provoked by visitors. Anyway, I'm just guessing here. Just try and keep a lookout for anything strange or out of place. I saw something that night, but it was not what was reported in the papers. This is how a park ranger described his experience. The incident occurred on November 18th, 2015, near the town of Mountain Park in Arizona. After being contacted by a man by the name of Nick, who formerly worked as a search and rescue volunteer for the parks department, the investigation began. 2 rangers were driving through an area known as Hawser Wash. They saw something out there they could not explain, so they called their supervisor to check it out. One of them said he thought it was 2 coyotes fighting at first, but it looked like they were circling each other. After arriving at the location where the sighting took place, the supervisor kept his binoculars focused on the area. He saw 2 creatures, but one of them appeared to be more human-like than the other. The other creature was much more giant, and its body wasn't evident because of a shrub partially obscuring it. Although he could not determine their height or precise number because they moved around so much, he estimated there were at least 3 of them in total. The ranger said that the supervisor described what happened next as alien abduction-like. He paused for a moment after telling me this information before continuing with further details about the encounter. He told them that one of the creatures was about 4 feet tall and had white hair. The other creature was about 6 feet tall with brown hair. Both of them walked bipedally like humans, but the ranger said they appeared to be able to stand on 2 legs or 4. The supervisor then saw one creature grab the other by the waist and lift it over its head. He tried the radio for help once he realized what was happening, but his radio failed to work. When it finally did, all he heard were weird, strange static noises coming from his colleagues before everything fell silent. After about 15 minutes had passed without any sign of the missing staff members, their vehicle was located by another ranger who had gone out searching for them. The fellow ranger said that when he found their vehicles at Hosser Wash, both vehicles were pulled off into an area where nobody else ever parked. The windows were rolled down, and the doors were not locked, but both park member staffs were missing. I asked how the incident ended. No one had heard from them again, but this isn't the only UFO-related abduction in that area. I've never heard of anything like this happening before, he continued. That's why I contacted you about it. The ranger then gave some additional information about the creature he described. They had dark eyes, which reminded him of a dog's eyes at night when there's no light out. While I'm not exactly sure what it is we saw, whether it be skinwalkers or some sort of strange, supernatural humanoids. However, these are just examples of the things that occur in these remote areas that nobody ever hears about. Had my encounter out in the Black Canyon National Park. This ranger was stationed at one of Colorado's national parks for about 5 years. During that time, he had some very engaging experiences while outdoors on patrol. Myself and 2 other rangers were told by a former superintendent to never go into or around an area called Thunder Mountain. He said he didn't know what it was, but some things had happened there. Weird things. It is located between Rico and Gunnison on Highway 135 near the river. Anyway, be careful when you are up there, because something dangerous lurks down there. My friends John and I had gone on several night hikes in spots like this before. We loved our starry nights. One night, we decided it would be cool to go up to Thunder Mountain. I say astonishing because it was like 45 degrees out. The area is near Gunnison River, and there are no trails either. You have to bushwhack through some thick forest. After walking for about an hour, we happened upon an open area by the banks of this river. The sky was crystal clear, without a single cloud in sight. John asked me if he could tie his shoes, which were rubbing him wrong at the moment. So, while he did that, I decided to walk down the bank a little ways off from him. I suddenly got this feeling of nervousness come over me, but then dismissed it, thinking that it was just going spooky. I then remember looking up at the sky and spotting 3 things that looked like stars moving across the sky. They were not crafts of any kind. There was no sound being emitted from them. The lights would slowly fade in and out of view, as they were making sure, like I could see them. This scared me. However, still thinking it was nothing, I continued to watch these objects move closer and closer. It wasn't until one of those lights got low enough for me to kind of make out what it was, and that's when I knew something bad was about to happen. It had a triangle shape with about 4 lights on each side. About this time, my friend comes up from behind me, asks what is going on. You could see the terror in his eyes when he spotted these lights. So, we both watched them for a moment or so, when suddenly they stop moving and make this loud sound like whoosh right above our heads. The object was about 50 feet off the ground, and it appeared to be hovering over us for some time. It looked like an air tanker type vehicle with 1 light on each corner, but without any numbers or other markings. I then realized that 2 objects had joined up with the other 3 that were already there. At this point, my friend began screaming at me to get away from here, now. We continued to back up until we reach a wall of trees behind us. We decide to hide behind a ledge of boulders. The next thing I know, the whole ground is shaking and vibrating. If it wasn't for those trees we were hiding behind, we would have been tossed into the air. Then, something started sounding like a cross between a screech owl and a baby crying, just at very loud volumes. This scared the hell out of us more than anything. It continued to make this noise over and over, as if it were trying to tap into our brains or something. By now, my friend wants nothing to do with any of this anymore, so he starts running away from there as fast as he can go. In his haste, though, he gets snagged on one of the trees. The thing flew directly above us, with at least 3 other of these UFOs close by that looked just like it. They were all lined up in single file formation, with the lead object being the largest of them all. I had never seen anything like this before in my life. My friend was terrified and he says too, he has never seen anything scarier than what we both saw that night. As this object passed directly above our heads, we noticed a door on the bottom part of it, and this door seemed to open up, more like a square hole, with a blinding light shooting out of it, and this reptilian being with wings comes jumping out. It had no hair but was greenish, with rugged scales all over its body, and small beady eyes. While we watched this thing fly down, I noticed that 3 other objects flew off to the horizon. The creature then began making its way back where we saw it come. My fellow colleague and friend passed out from fear. The only thing I can say about this experience is that creatures or entities are for sure visiting this planet, and because of my experience, I do genuinely believe, after having seen these creatures with my own eyes, that they exist. But who are they? What are they? And why are they here? Only God knows for sure, and the government doesn't want you to know anything about their existence. So they make everything appear as if it's all a joke or a hoax. That way, everybody will think it's nothing, like this exists except in someone's imagination. I was a park ranger for 18 years, and the first sighting occurred in a forested area east of Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. It was near a lake that is now drained where we were doing some herbicide control on poison ivy. I saw several small white figures off to my left as I walked along a forest trail at dusk. They were running single file through the woods, about 10 feet away from me. I had just come around an S-bend in the trail, and it led out to this opening that opened up towards the lake, but was blocked by thick forest on all sides except to my left, where they came out into the opening with me at dusk, following me silently down the trail for about 100 yards. I sat there in astonishment, as I could not believe what I was seeing, and they had stopped about 15 yards from me, and were standing there in a line looking at me. They appeared humanoid but small, maybe 3 feet tall with an athletic build, white skin, and naked. I could see no real eyes or facial features, just smooth skin on their face and head. Not sure really what to do, I tried my best to make a retreat. Not knowing what I was dealing with, I turned and ran down the trail towards my truck, leaving them there. I could hear nothing that they made, not even footsteps, as they appeared to follow along behind me, still almost in this strange single-file formation. After running mainly about 300 yards, I stopped to catch my breath with no sign of them coming after me, as I began walking back to see if they were still there and convincing myself I had hallucinated it. As I approached where I had last seen them at dusk, they appeared again out of nowhere, right before me, now on the other side of the trail, walking away from me, behind a large hemlock tree. I watched them disappear into the woods without sight over an old stone wall along this boundary that looked like it had been there since colonial times. I have never seen that stone wall in my life, and I have been here countless times. I'm quite baffled at the entire experience, and I'm not sure what to make of it. I later learned that there was a large burial ground for natives during the 1800s right near where I had seen them, long before it became a national park. Very little left, though, to see, of course. I had a second experience seeing similar beings as well, only it was a cold afternoon. I was walking along the edge of a pond with steep bluffs that dropped into the water, where I could be alone and see for about half a mile in all directions, except behind me. I was standing on one of these bluffs, overlooking the pond, when I saw white figures moving along the edge of the water, just over the crest of the bluff. They were walking very fast on 2 legs, but hunched. At first, I thought they were dogs, because they were moving so strangely on all fours. There were 2 of them, and they were moving very quickly. I studied them for a short while before they disappeared into the thicket on the northern end of the pond. I thought it was odd they were that out of place. I debated telling anybody about this experience for a while, as I could not make sense of it, and I did not know if anybody would believe me or think I was crazy. But I'm happy to have found your group, as I can no longer keep this a secret. My family and I were visiting the San Francisco Bay Area from Colorado State. We went on a hike in the Tilden Park. We had just arrived at Wildcat Peak, when my son ran ahead along the ridge. About 10 minutes later, he came back running scared. There was sweat and fear written all over his face. He was terrified and said he saw something that looked like the predator looking down at him from about 20 feet up on top of some trees. He was scared and thought I should go look, but I told him it is probably nothing, but still curious to see what he saw. I went back to where he was standing and peering into the trees, looking for a sign of anything. Branches began moving about 10 feet up, and my heart jumped out of my chest. I could not tell if this thing had been lying down or crouching behind the tree until it stood up as soon as I had arrived. It took 2 full steps towards me, with eyes locked on mine before realizing there was no cover available if we were pursued. We both froze together in a stare-off that would last maybe a minute before it finally retreated 20 feet up a hillside and finally was completely out of sight. I explained to my son what I saw, and he said it had similar features, but was definitely not human. I think we both agreed there. It was very muscular. The arms were long with large hands, and the thing was around 8 to 9 feet tall, according to my son. I asked him what it was wearing, and he explained it wasn't wearing anything. It was naked. He had saw exactly what I did, and then I asked him if there's anything else that stood out about the way it looked, and he mentioned the skull shape of how its head was. My son is highly credible on weird stuff for somebody at his age, 13, so when he first told me, I was skeptical but was bound to believe him. I couldn't get any more information out of him before I continued on my hike to see what this thing was myself, and that's of course right when I saw it. I try to be very analytical and critical of my findings. I work as a part-time ranger and also in search and rescue sometimes, so these kinds of things, they take me by surprise, but when they happen, I try to be open-minded. In 1959, I was a seasonal park ranger at Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument in Washington State. On September 23rd of that same year, the Cowlitz County Sheriff called me and asked if I could search for a missing man who had not returned home from a hike into the Climbers Biovac area inside the monument. He told me that an old logger claimed to have seen a Bigfoot walking up Rainy Creek away from Spirit Lake around 1:30 in the afternoon, about the time that Frank Tanneby disappeared while hiking up this creek. I met with the logger, Fred Beckman, talked with him, and got as much information as I could about his sighting. This included details on what he had seen and a description of how it walked. He was adamant that the subject was not a bear, nor had he seen a bear or any other animal that was bear-like. It also did not resemble what Beckman said he saw in 1925 Ape Canyon incident when 5 prospectors saw several large ape-like creatures for over an hour before they threw rocks down upon them and from their high perches up on a narrow canyon wall. Beckman told me that his Bigfoot stood about 6 feet tall, very muscular build, had the size of a man's, slightly sloping in front and rising in the back to form a crest. He had short hair which looked black in color, but there were lighter and darker streaks in it. He also said the creature had no visible neck, and its wide shoulders were hunched forward. The arms were long, reaching well below the knees. Each arm was at a right angle, and to the side of it, as it raised to throw a rock. He saw only the front of the Bigfoot as it turned to walk up Rainy Creek, away from Spirit Lake toward Lava Canyon. He also noticed that there were no signs of breasts on this animal, and that its genitals looked like those of a male. He also had a secondary sighting in 1965 in the same area by the creek. He approached closer and saw a large Bigfoot sitting on its haunches, watching him at a distance of roughly 100 yards away. The creature was leaning forward as if it had just stood up from lying down. It looked like a big man, but with dark hair. The hair appeared shorter than the logger had remembered in 1959. The skin appeared very dark. He saw no genitalia on this one either. He watched the creature for about 1 minute before it stood up, walked away. Again, he could only see its front as it walked out of sight into the forest on the other side of the creek bed. He noticed that this Bigfoot was not as muscular as Beckman's. although it had a bigger head with no crest. It appeared to be about 6.5 feet tall, roughly, with slightly bent knees. The arms also hung down at the sides. It did not appear to have any neck, and its chest looked more flabby than muscular. There were no signs of nipples on the chest, or any signs in the lower abdomen that there was no hair. The skin appeared very smooth and hairless. Beckman said this creature was gray, but there were also brown streaks in its hair, but primarily black. Both sightings happened within a mile of Spirit Lake on the northern slope of Mount St. Helens. This is where Rainy Creek and Coldwater Creek come together, which is near an area we call TNT. A few years ago, before I had my own strange experience in this area, in June of 1979, while on a camping trip to the monument with 2 friends, we stayed at a ranger's cabin located on the northern slope near Spirit Lake. In the evening after dark, I heard very strange vocalizations from somewhere in the forest surrounding our campsite. Although the sounds were far away, they were distinct, something like a person imitating the call of a wolf. I never heard this before or since. There was no answer to it from anywhere else. Even though the sound was loud enough to have been heard for at least 3 miles, there wasn't so much as an echo off the surrounding hills. The sound was almost deafening, but it did not seem to disturb the wildlife in the forest. We heard this call at least 3 times that night, always late in the evening after dark. The following day, we had told another ranger about the weird wolf calls, and he informed us other rangers had heard the strange sounds too, from the same area. However, no one had ever investigated these sounds or found their source. The ranger said that when he first came to this area in 1978, there were lots of fresh footprints along Rainy Creek and Coldwater Creek near his cabin. Although the prints resembled human footprints, they were too big for normal people to leave. They only remained for a short time, and they were followed by an alarming increase in reports of Bigfoot sightings in this area, particularly near Rainy Creek and Coldwater Creek. This place seems to be a hot spot for these things, the ranger had said. He told us that there had been sightings by numerous people here, including himself. I've seen one on Rainy Creek. Several times I've heard them at night. Once in 1980, I even saw one walk across the road about 100 yards in front of my truck. I asked him if he could describe it. He said about 9 feet tall, and the arms swung down to its knees. It looked very muscular, having long black hair all over it like a dog. Personally, I think there is something strange going on here, and I don't know what it is. I had a sighting last year in a national park. I'm a park ranger there, and my office is fairly close to where it happened. It was about 10:30 p.m. when the night shift dispatcher got a call from the day shift saying that one of our rangers had seen an unidentified flying object in the area. So we all went out to see what it was. We're driving around, shining our flashlights around in the sky, looking for anything out of the ordinary, when all of a sudden, there was what appeared to be a low rumbling sound that progressively got louder and louder, and then stopped abruptly. A few seconds after, it started up again, stopping many times. It sounded like an explosion, followed by silence, then another explosion, repeating over and over again. It was pretty strange. We thought it might be some sort of military aircraft, so we radioed the Civil Air Patrol to ask if they had any planes out that night, or were planning on flying in the area. They said no, asking us what kind of noise it was making. They had not heard anything from their end. We kept looking around and shining our flashlights everywhere we could think of, the sky, the horizon, thinking maybe we'd catch a glimpse of something. But there was nothing. The noise continued on repeating itself intermittently for about 3 hours. We began to check the area more thoroughly, thinking maybe it was coming from an underground or something. We began checking the ground with our flashlights, and we came across a large area of grass where weeds and grass alike had been flattened in a circular pattern, about 15 feet across, with odd grooves carved into the dirt. It looked like some kind of landing pad, which made no sense because we were in the middle of nowhere. Then, from around the side of a bush, about 12 feet away from us, this huge creature leapt out into our circle of light, and just stood there for a few moments, letting us take it in. It was definitely something we were not expecting to run across in the wilderness of Texas, that's for sure. It was humanoid and reptilian at the same time. It stood on two legs like a person would, with its arms extended to either side of it, like wings or flippers. But where I expected hands to be, there were just long claws instead. I've never seen anything like it before. Its head was also something like I had never seen on another animal, if that's what you can even call it. It was snake-like, with a closed mouth, and a face that was more amphibious, only much larger and much more frightening to look at. It stood there for about 5 or so seconds, staring at us motionless, and then vanished into the bush, making the same explosive sound that we had been hearing for hours, and just seemed to vanish altogether. The dispatcher radioed back that they had not heard anything like what we described, so whatever it was not somebody flying a plane or anything. As far as the reptilian creature, we're not sure. We had looked back at the landing pad and noticed the grass was still flattened like when we had first seen it. But now, underneath where this creature had stood, were these two circular indentations in the ground, each about 4 inches deep. They looked like footprints, but were lizard-like. We did not want to stick around any longer than we had to after that, let alone even touch the ground where it had stood. We all left together and made sure to get back to my office as quickly as possible. I do not want to go through something like this again. I know I didn't go into detail about it, but when this creature emerged from the bushes, we were terrified by the sighting of this thing. We just stood there, watching it, completely frozen in fear. I could not even call for backup because my voice was gone, and all I could do was stare at this thing that had just appeared before us. It's the only time in all my years of working as a ranger where I did not know what to do next. This encounter happened on the evening of November 18th, 1991, in the Palo Duro Canyon State Park in Texas. I would like to add the other rangers involved in this evening's events have a pretty open mind about the matter, but one of them was definitely very shaken up by what they saw. This creature, whatever it was, felt demonic in nature, like it was there to intimidate us or something. The other ranger who was there with me at the time of this initial appearance also commented that the creature made a noise like it was trying to communicate with us, or possibly intimidate us. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what it sounded like. I'm a park ranger. In 2008, I had an encounter with a type of entity that I now know as the mantis being. It was after 3 in the morning, on my way home from work, in the Grand Teton National Park. It was pitch black outside, and all of this happened very quickly. I saw a tall figure standing next to my car door. Its height, about 6 feet tall, not including the antennae, which were at least 8 to 12 inches long. This was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my life. It was some sort of mantis insectoid humanoid. I had pulled over onto the side of the road very quickly to check my voicemail, as I saw my wife had called me and left me something important. After pulling off to the side of the road and checking on my voicemail, I felt the figure stand next to my car. I looked up, thinking it was somebody going to try to break in. It was instead this horrible creature. I screamed, throwing my phone down in reaction, and putting my car into drive and pulling away as fast as possible. When I looked back in the rearview mirror, there was nowhere this thing could have gone, and it was nowhere to be seen. Let me just reinstate that when I made eye contact with this thing, I felt a paralysis go over my entire body. It's like it had some sort of control over me. I can't really begin to describe it. After talking with a few fellow colleagues of mine, there aren't many of us who have actually had similar experiences. However, a good friend of mine, whose name I will not include out of respect for him, had a very similar experience, in which he saw the same mantid humanoid a few years back, right around July of 2013. He says that right before he saw this thing, he felt these strange jolts of electricity going through his body, and described the sensation as very odd, and only a few minutes later did he see this strange creature, He said the impression he got was that this being was trying to intimidate him, as well as lure him closer. He was terrified, but never mentioned it to anybody. The only reason he opened up to me about his account is because I told him my experience. And when I did, I just remember all the color draining from his face completely. As he then went on to tell me about what he experienced. This incident occurred on May 18th, 2005. I was working as a ranger at a small local park, recently renamed Camp Glen from what I'm told. I was closing the park, went out to my patrol vehicle to check the time cards. After checking them, I left the office building, walking to my truck. It was around midnight, because it's very dark at night in these woods, perfect for unsavory characters or creatures that want privacy. When I got into my truck and began driving off towards the exit of the park, something caught my attention. There is access roads that runs behind all of our buildings where we can put things in pickup trucks and such. This made me curious when I saw a large figure standing in front of one of our smaller sheds. I turned my vehicle around, parking on a road that leads to a path which I took. I had a large flashlight attached to my belt loop, so I got it out of its holster, shining it at this figure. This made me realize how big this thing was. It was of average height, but the width of its shoulders were amazingly large, as it could have been built like a tank or something. Its head was shaped more of an oblong circle, with slight features similar to what you would have seen from a mantis's face, except much larger. I shined my flashlight directly at its face for a good second or two before it darted behind the shed, being cautious not to make any sudden movements. I went around to where I saw it, noticing that nothing was out of the ordinary. No tracks were left in the dirt, and there weren't any broken twigs or branches scattered about. I was quite scared and confused, but continued on with my original objective, which was solely to check the time cards. When I got into my truck, started driving again, something else made me turn back towards the spot where this thing disappeared. I noticed there were deep tracks left in the hard-packed trail. Well, the next morning that I woke up, I had mysterious bruising on my lower back, which have now faded away. They are no longer there, except for one small one near my spine. I've been in the Forest Service industry for 7 years now, all of them serving faithfully as a park ranger. I've seen many crazy things during this time frame, and it has influenced the way that I view the world today. I was called to a location in Elk Grove, California, to investigate a cryptid encounter / possible vandalism right near Mack Road, Grand Avenue, near the American River. After doing some research online, I found out that this location once held an old rock quarry and landfill. The landfill was closed and covered back up in the late 60s, but was still very active at this time of encounter. This is where my story begins. It was Sunday morning. I was called in to investigate a graffiti complaint that involved some sort of creature being seen on the other side of the river. Upon arriving to the scene, I spoke with the complainant, the property owner. He was very bothered by what had happened and asked me to try and catch the perpetrators. I asked him if he'd like me to take a report, but he declined, saying that his insurance would cover it. I asked if he'd like me to send a ranger back out on Monday, but he also declined this. After speaking with the landowner, I walked towards the river. I heard what sounded like sonic booms coming from the other side of the riverbank. On several occasions when I was younger, I would hear sonic booms coming from the nearby military base, but this sound was much different. This sound made my stomach drop and my mind go blank. I could feel a slight pressure change as if something was moving toward me. I felt uneasy. After the booms, I had heard large footsteps moving toward me from behind a bush. Then, what I presumed to be a humanoid reptile stepped out from behind the bush and into the clearing. It was nearly 8 feet tall, had a large elongated head and very pale white scales. Its eyes were large and slanted, long arms, and appeared to have difficulty walking due to its slender, nearly weak legs. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I know it was there for a few moments. After I regained my senses, I tried to get a good look at the creature, but it was retreating back down towards the river. It's hard to remember much more details about it, other than that it was very skinny looking. The next day, my supervisor and I investigated the area around where the complaint took place. I never told him the creature that I had seen there previously. It was here, during this investigation, that my supervisor and I came face to face with this creature. After investigating for several hours, a full shift, my supervisor and I were walking back to the truck when we both saw the large reptile-like head peering from behind the same bush about 30 yards from where we were currently standing. It ducked down as soon as it saw us looking at it. We ran around the bush to see if we could find it, but it was gone. It didn't have a discernible neck, and its head weighed probably 150 pounds. Its coloration was very light, almost white, with a hint of green. Its scales were small and finely textured, and it moved almost gracefully. I think the one we saw this day was different than the one I saw the previous day. My supervisor was just as shocked as I was, and to this day, we both don't really talk about it.